been staring at a map of South Asia all morning. And I'll be honest, usually when we do these deep dives, I feel like I have a pretty good handle on the baseline reality.
The ground rules, so to speak.
Exactly. Gravity is down, the sky is blue, the Roman Empire was in Italy. But the file we're opening today, it's unsettling.
Unsettling is probably the right word. It challenges something so fundamental that most of us, I think, don't even realize it's an assumption we're making.
That's it right there. We're talking about the geography of the ancient world, specifically the Buddha land. Now, if you open any history textbook or go to any museum or even just Google it right now,
you get one answer.
One answer. The Middle Kingdom, the place where Faxian, that famous 5th century Chinese monk, traveled, it's always mapped to northern India and Nepal. That is, for all intents and purposes, established fact.
It is the standard academic consensus, yes.
Yeah.
And it has been for a very long time, since the mid-19th century, really.
But the documents we have in front of us today, and this is a whole stack of forensic reevaluations, linguistic breakdowns, archaeological audits, they are arguing that the map is wrong.
And not just a little bit wrong.
No, not a few miles off wrong. They are arguing that we have essentially misplaced the cradle of Buddhism for over 150 years. The core thesis here, and it's a big one, is that Faxian's Middle Kingdom wasn't in India at all. It was in Sri Lanka.
Or, to use the more accurate historical term for the region, Hela Deshaya. And look, before anyone listening just dismisses this as some fringe theory, we need to look at the methodology they're using.
Right.
The source material isn't relying on mysticism or, just vibes. The main source is titled A Forensic Reevaluation of the Geographic Core of the Buddha Land. They're using hard data, distance calculations, structural analysis of ruins, even colonial legal texts to build a case that is, well, it's surprisingly difficult to dismantle.
That's what got me, the math. We're going to get deep into the numbers because there's a very specific claim here that Faxian's itinerary matches the Sri Lankan landscape to the dot.
Whereas in India, you have to do some gymnastics to make it work.
A lot of gymnastics. But before we get to the geometry of it all, we have to talk about the history of the history. I mean, why do we think it's India in the first place? Where did this idea even come from?
And that brings us right to what our sources call the crisis of localization and the Indo-centric problem. To really get this, you have to rewind the clock, go back to the 1800s.
The British Empire.
At its absolute zenith. They control India, which they see as the jewel in the crown. And archaeology was this burgeoning new field, but it was also, you have to remember, a tool of empire.
And the big name at the center of all this is Alexander Cunningham.
Sir Alexander Cunningham. He's known as the father of the Archaeological Survey of India. He was the man tasked with mapping the ancient sites described in these old travelogues from pilgrims like Faxian.
So he's got Faxian's text, a record of Buddhistic kingdoms in one hand, and a map of British India in the other.
And his job is to make them match.
Okay, but here's the problem. The source points out right away. It's a huge discrepancy. Faxian describes a middle kingdom, that is. Well, it's thriving. He talks about extraordinary peace, immense wealth, people who are rich and happy.
It's golden age.
A golden age. Yeah. He describes multi-storied palaces. He describes gold-leafed viharas, which are monasteries, and stupas, these massive domes inlaid with silver. He is walking through a civilization at its absolute peak.
It's a vibrant, living, breathing civilization. But when Cunningham and his contemporaries went to the sites in the Ganges Plains that they decided were these locations, what did they find?
Dust.
Effectively, yes. Cunningham himself, in his own reports, writes about finding sites in extreme desolation. He found earthen mounds, ruins, debris, not golden palaces.
Okay, but hang on. The obvious counterargument is, well, of course they're ruins. It was 1,400 years earlier. Time passes, things fall down.
And that's the standard defense. And it's a reasonable one on the surface. It was 1,400 years ago. Of course it's ruined. But the source argues there's a critical discrepancy in the type of ruin.
What do you mean, the type?
Faxian describes structural integrity. He's talking about massive stone and brick monuments, some of them hundreds of feet tall. He talks about operational universities with thousands of resident monks. The source argues that the ruins found in northern India, even allowing for the passage of time, simply do not possess the scale or the architectural bones of the civilization Faxian recorded.
So Cunningham finds a mound of dirt in Bihar. He checks his map, sees it's roughly in the right spot if he, squints a bit and says, aha, this must be the palace.
That is essentially the accusation. And this is what they call the Indo-centric problem. It's the idea that these colonial archaeologists started with an assumption. The assumption was that Jambudvipa, the ancient name for the land of the Buddha, must be the Indian continent.
Why? Just because it was big?
Because it was the big, important landmass that they controlled. They were perhaps unconsciously trying to force a square peg into a round hole. The source claims they prioritized the continental assumption over the actual forensic descriptions in Faxian's text.
And all the while, the source posits that while India was lying in this desolation during that period, there was another civilization just south of the ocean that was actually in its golden age.
Yes, Hiladeshaya, Sri Lanka. If you look at the Anuradhapura kingdom in the 5th century, it matches the description of wealth, stability, and truly monumental architectural grandeur almost perfectly. But to even entertain that idea, we have to get past a major linguistic hurdle, a single word.
The word Deepa.
Deepa or Deepa, depending on the transliteration.
Right. And in Pali and Sanskrit, I've always been told this means island. So Jambudvipa is often translated as the Rose Apple Island. Sri Lanka is an island. India is a subcontinent. So how can India possibly be a Deepa?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Traditionally, scholars get around this by arguing it's a metaphorical island. A land surrounded by oceans on 3 sides and the impassable Himalayas on the north. It functions like an island.
Okay, I can see that. It's a bit of a stretch, but...
It is. But our source takes a much more literal and, I think, a more linguistic approach. They argue that Deepa doesn't necessarily mean a piece of land completely surrounded by water. Its primary meaning is simply land, territory, or country.
So it's a political or a geographical designation, not a hydrographical one. It's not about the water.
Exactly. It's about jurisdiction, a realm. And the source goes further, and this is where it gets really interesting. It claims that ancient Hiladeshaya, the land we now call Sri Lanka, wasn't just one monolithic block. It was understood as a federation of multiple Deepas.
Multiple lands within the one island.
Yes. The outline here lists them. Jambudvipa, Sinhala-Deepa, Naga-Deepa, Oja-Deepa, Wara-Deepa. All distinct regions, all called Deepa.
Wait, hold on, back up. Jambudvipa is on that list.
It is.
You're saying the source claims that Jambudvipa, the classic name for the Indian subcontinent in virtually all Buddhist texts, was actually just a province in Sri Lanka.
That is the radical claim at the heart of this. They argue that Jambudvipa, or Jambudvipa, as it's also known, was a specific region within the island. They even try to locate it, what they call the Deva area, which is about 57 miles east of modern-day Colombo.
That sounds almost too convenient. Is there any actual, hard evidence that Sri Lanka was viewed this way, as a collection of lands or countries?
This is where they bring in the colonial legal documents, which I thought was a brilliant move. The source points directly to the 1815 Kandyan Convention.
Okay, that's a pivotal document in Sri Lankan history. It's the treaty where the Kandyan chiefs officially ceded the kingdom to the British crown.
Correct. It's the end of native rule. Now, what does the text of that treaty actually say? The source highlights the specific Sinhala wording used in the original document. It doesn't just say, we hand over the island of Ceylon.
What does it say?
It says they're handing over the control of Hiladeshaya Radawal.
Rata wall. My Sinhala is non-existent, so you'll have to break that down for me.
Rata means country or land. Wal is the plural marker. So the treaty literally says the countries of the Gila land.
The countries. Plural, not country, singular.
Exactly. The argument is that as late as 1815, the local rulers and the people who drafted this treaty still understood their territory as a federation of distinct lands, a collection of Deepas or Ratas. But the British, for administrative ease and maybe for other reasons, collapsed all of that complexity into a single, simple label, Ceylon.
So they took a federation of countries, which might have included Sinhala-Deepa, Jambudvipa, Naga-Deepa, and just slapped one name on the whole thing. And in doing so, they completely erased the memory of those internal borders.
And by erasing those borders on the map, they erased the possibility that Jambudvipa could be right there, inside the island, all along. The source suggests this was, if not intentional, then at least a conveniently negligent obfuscation. It's much easier to rule a single colony than a complex federation of historic lands.
It's a really powerful idea. If Deepa just means land, then the entire Buddha land doesn't have to be a continent. And the source makes another point, right? It says the texts always insist on Deepa, not Artha Deepa.
Right. Artha Deepa would mean peninsula, but the texts are specific. The Buddha is born in a Deepa. The key events of his life happen in a Deepa. If you interpret that as land or province, the geography opens up completely. But if you rigidly interpret Deepa as continent for India and island for Sri Lanka, you get stuck in the 19th century model.
Okay, so linguistically the door is now open, but let's, walk through that door and check the floor plan. We have to talk about the measurements. Because Faxian didn't just say, I went over there. He gave distances. He used specific units, li and yojana.
Ah, the measurement problem. This is the bane of almost all ancient history. Faxian, being Chinese, uses the Chinese unit li. The local Indian and Sri Lankan texts he's referencing use the yojana. To map Faxian's journey onto India, scholars have spent a century and a half trying to figure out a consistent conversion rate.
And what's the standard conversion? What do the textbooks say?
That's the whole problem. There isn't one. In what the source calls the continental theory, that's the one mapping his journey to India, scholars have to constantly adjust the value of a yojana.
What do you mean, adjust?
I mean, to make the distance between two cities fit the description, they might calculate it as 4.5 miles. But then, to make the next leg of the journey to a mountain fit, they have to stretch the same unit to maybe 7 miles. It's an elastic ruler.
That sounds like cheating. The map doesn't fit, so let's just change the ruler until it does.
It is, from a scientific perspective, deeply frustrating. But the source for this deep dive proposes a solution. They claim to have identified a specific, consistent unit, the island yojana, which they say was the standard unit used in Hiladeshaya.
Okay, a new unit. What is the island yojana? How long is it?
They calculated at approximately 16 kilometers, which is almost exactly 10 miles. Or, if you're using Faxian's own Chinese units, it's about 18.6 lead.
10 miles. Okay, that's a nice, clean number. So the big question is, does it work?
The source claims it works to the dot, and they offer up what they call a smoking gun example. That is, well, it's really hard to dismiss. It involves the Buddha's footprints.
The footprints of the Buddha. Faxian mentioned seeing 2 of them, right?
Yes, and he is very, very specific. He writes that he visited 2 sacred footprints. One is located in the royal city, the other's on a mountaintop, and the distance between them is exactly 15 yohanas.
Okay, so we have a simple math problem. 15 yohanas times this new island yohana of 10 miles. That's 150 miles.
Roughly, yes. Now let's look at the traditional narrative, the Indian map. For decades, archaeologists have scoured northern India trying to find 2 major pilgrimage sites, a royal city and a sacred mountain, with footprints that are 15 yohanas apart. They can't. They find one here, maybe a symbolic one over there, but the distance relation never ever fits without breaking the scale completely. It is, according to the source, a total mismatch.
But if we apply the same calculation to Sri Lanka...
This is the moment that kind of gives you goosebumps. If you start at the ancient royal city Anuradhapura, the undisputed capital for over 1,000 years, and you draw a line 15 island yojanas, or about 150 miles to the south, your line lands directly on the summit of Sripada.
Adam's Peak.
Adam's Peak. The most famous and most sacred mountain in the entire region. The one that is famous precisely because it has a sacred footprint at its very top.
Wait a second. So the physical distance from the undisputed historic capital to the undisputed historic sacred mountain is exactly the distance that Faxian recorded in the 5th century, provided you use the local unit of measurement.
Correct. The alignment is precise, and physically the description makes perfect sense. Yeah. You have the royal city Anuradhapura in the flat north central plains, and you have the sacred mountain, Sripada, rising out of the central highlands. The geometry matches the text.
That's startling. I mean, Adam's Peak is not some small hidden hill. It's a massive, iconic landmark. If Faxian is describing a footprint on a high mountain 15 yojanas from the capital, and Sri Lanka has exactly that configuration, while India has nothing comparable at that scale, that's a really heavy point for the island theory.
It's a huge piece of evidence. And it's not just the distance, it's the overall description of the Middle Kingdom itself. Faxian writes, and I'm quoting here, "The king governs without corporal punishment. Criminals are simply fined according to the circumstances. The people are rich and prosperous. The inhabitants do not have to register their households with the magistrates."
It sounds like a libertarian paradise. But historically, does that description actually match 5th century Sri Lanka?
The source argues it's a perfect description of the administrative style of the Anuradhapura and Ruhuna kingdoms during that specific era. This was a time of immense agricultural surplus, all fueled by their incredibly advanced irrigation systems, the giant reservoirs they called tanks. There was stability. There was wealth. The Middle Kingdom, Jingguo, in Faxian's original Chinese, was simply the title he gave to this central, prosperous administration he was witnessing.
So the Middle Kingdom isn't China, and it isn't India. According to this, it's the central Deepa, the heartland of the Gila Federation.
That is the thesis, the powerful, stable core of the island.
But a map isn't just about one mountain and a capital city. Faxian was on a pilgrimage. He was a devout Buddhist collecting sacred texts and visiting holy relics. He had an itinerary. Does the rest of the journey hold up to this forensic analysis? Or is the Adams Peak thing just a very lucky coincidence?
This is where we get into section 4 of our deep dive, the relic itinerary. And honestly, this is the part that reads like a detective show. The source argues that Faxian's entire journey forms a logical, sequential loop around Sri Lanka, hitting the major relics in a plausible order.
Okay, let's walk the loop with him. Where does he start? What's the first relic?
Let's start with the skull bone relic.
Yeah.
Faxian calls the city where it's kept Hilo. He says it is the flat bone of the Buddhist skull. He describes it vividly. It's housed in a vihara that is covered in gold leaf and decorated with the 7 precious substances. And crucially, he adds a very specific administrative detail.
Which is?
It is guarded by 8 distinct families who hold the royal seal to its chamber.
8 families. That's not a vague detail. That's a very specific protocol.
It is. Now, traditional history, trying to make the Indian map work, places this site in Hadar, in modern-day Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan. That's a long, long way from the Ganges. That completely breaks the geographic flow of the journey.
It makes no sense geographically. But our source identifies this site as Siruwila in eastern Sri Lanka.
And why Siruwila? What's the connection?
Siruwila has a documented centuries-long history of housing the Lalata Dacha, which means the frontal bone relic of the Buddha. And historically, the custody of this incredibly sacred relic was entrusted to specific designated families under royal decree. The protocol of hereditary guardianship matches Faxian's description of the 8 families almost identically.
So instead of having to teleport to Afghanistan and back, he's just on the east coast of the island.
Correct. It keeps him within the same geographical unit. Then he moves on. The next major item on his list is the alms bowl relic.
Right, and he tells a pretty wild story about this one.
A fantastic story. He says a local king tried to steal the bowl. He brought elephants and wagons to carry it away, but the elephants, no matter how hard they were pushed, refused to move it an inch. They couldn't budge it. So the king, realizing it was a divine sign, gave up and built a stupa right there to house it.
A classic divine intervention story. So where does he see this?
This is a key point. Faxian says he saw this in a kingdom before he sailed to Sinhala.
Okay, wait. Pause right there. If he's already in Sri Lanka, because he was just in Siruwila on the east coast, how can he then sail to Sinhala? Doesn't that prove he was on the continent and Sinhala or Sri Lanka was his next stop?
That's the trap of the colonial map. This goes right back to the Rada Wall concept. If Sri Lanka is a federation of Deepas or countries, then moving from the northern region, which was likely known as Nagadeepa, it was a major maritime province, to the southern core administrative region, which was Sinhala-Deepa, would absolutely be seen as traveling between countries.
Ah, I see. So it's an internal journey between 2 different lands on the same island. So he's probably in the northern maritime hub somewhere like modern Mannar or the Jaffna Peninsula?
Exactly. The source identifies these as the great northern naval hubs, distinct Rada Wall that were heavily engaged in international trade. He sees the alms bowl there, which corresponds to other historical Sri Lankan accounts of the bowl being housed in the north, and then he travels south to the royal city in the interior.
Which brings us to the big one. The one relic everyone knows about. The tooth relic.
This is the one point of overlap. Everyone, even in the traditional narrative, agrees the tooth relic was in Sri Lanka by this time. But the source argues the context is key. Faxian describes a massive, month-long procession. The roads are swept clean, flowers are scattered everywhere. The tooth is brought out from the palace and taken to the Abhayagiri Vihara.
And he describes the building itself, doesn't he?
He does, in incredible detail. He describes the Abhayagiri tope, the stupa, as being 400 cubits high.
Let's stop there for a second. 400 cubits, we need to visualize what that means. A cubit is roughly 1.5 feet, maybe a bit more. So we are talking about a structure that is 600 feet tall.
At least.
That's twice the height of the Statue of Liberty. That's significantly taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza was in his day. This would have been one of the largest man-made structures on Earth.
It's an absolutely immense claim. And this is where the Indocentric theory really starts to collapse, according to the source. If you look at the archaeological record in India in the 5th century, there are no standing structures of that height. There aren't even ruins that suggest a structure of that scale.
But if you go to Anuradhapura today...
If you go to Anuradhapura today, and you stand at the base of the Jatavanrama and the Abhayagiri stupas. They are literal mountains of brick.
They actually match that massive scale.
Even in their ruined state, having lost their spires, they are colossal. The Jatavanrama, when completed, was the third tallest structure in the entire ancient world, only behind the two great pyramids at Giza. The source's argument is simple. Faxian wasn't exaggerating. He was an engineer and a cartographer by training. He was measuring. He saw 400-cubit structure because there was a 400-cubit structure. And it's in Sri Lanka, not India.
That's a very compelling point. You can't fake a skyscraper. It's either there in the archaeological record or it isn't.
And finally, the fourth major relic on his tour, the Bodhi tree. Faxian describes seeing a branch of the original Bodhi tree, which had been planted in the royal city. He says it was 200 cubits high.
And Anuradhapura is, of course, famous for the Sri Mahabodhi,
which is documented as being the oldest living tree in the world with a known planting date, brought as a cutting from the original tree. The source claims that the Bodhi trees pointed to in India are all successors. They've been replanted over the centuries after wars or natural death. But the tree in Anuradhapura has the documented unbroken continuity. It matches the living witness status that Faxian describes to it.
So the loop is skull bone in the east at Sirawila, alms bowl in the trading hubs of the north like Jaffna or Mannar, then inland to the capital, Anuradhapura, for the tooth in the tree. It's a clean, logical circuit.
It's a coherent geographic loop. There's no need to teleport to Afghanistan. There's no need to skip over thousands of miles of desolation in India. It all fits neatly within the Federation of Heladishaya.
But there's one thing that still nags at me a little. Faxian talks about the sea a lot. He travels by boat. If he's just hopping around one island, even a big one like Sri Lanka, why is he constantly getting on a ship? Why not just walk?
That's a very modern perspective, I think. We look at a road map of Sri Lanka today and we see a highway from Jaffna to Colombo and think it's an easy drive. But in the 5th century, the interior of that island was a completely different beast.
The outline mentions central rigged hills.
The central highlands of Sri Lanka are incredibly rugged. We're talking mountains, dense rainforests, deep escarpments. And Faxian himself specifically mentions dangerous wild animals.
Lions, tigers?
Leopards, bears, and huge herds of elephants. The interior was wild and dangerous. The source argues that for the ancient inhabitants, the highway was the ocean. The safest, fastest, and most efficient way to get from the northern Nagadipa to the southern Sanaladipa or over to the eastern Siru region was to sail around the coast.
So he wasn't crossing a vast ocean between continents. He was circumnavigating the island. His voyages were coastal.
Exactly. This maritime logic reinterprets his entire journey. When he writes that he sailed for 14 days, our modern brain assumes that means a vast cross-oceanic distance. But in an ancient sailing vessel, tacking against coastal winds, maybe stopping at smaller ports along the way, that could easily be a coastal journey from the north to the south of the island.
This also connects to another major geographical feature that's mentioned in the sources, Ram Setu, which is also called Adam's Bridge, the chain of shoals and islets that connects the south of India and the north of Sri Lanka.
This is a critical piece of the geographical puzzle. There's strong geological evidence to suggest that prior to a massive cyclone in the year 1480, Ram Setu was a functional land bridge, or at the very least a chain of shoals that was traversable on foot during low tide.
So before 1480, you could have physically walked from the continent to the island.
Yes, and if you can walk there, is it really a separate island in the way we think of it today? Or is it functionally a peninsula? This completely blurs the lines between continent and Deepa.
It makes them contiguous.
Precisely. The source uses this to argue that Sri Lanka wasn't some isolated outpost. It was physically attached, it was accessible, it was part of the mainland cultural sphere, but still politically and geographically distinct enough to be its own Buddha land.
It effectively expands the definition of the mainland to include Sri Lanka.
Or, and I think this is the more radical point they're making, it suggests that our mainland concept itself is flawed. What if the cultural and religious center, the Middle Kingdom, was the island, the Deepa, and the vast peninsula to the north was actually the periphery? We might have been reading the map completely upside down all this time.
It's a complete inversion of the standard model. We're so used to thinking of India as the sun and Sri Lanka as the moon that revolves around it. This theory says Sri Lanka was the sun.
And that brings us full circle, right back to the British in the 19th century. The source is very, very critical of how this history was constructed. It uses strong phrases like the Jambudvipa error and colonial obfuscation.
We touched on this earlier with the renaming of the Rada Wall to just Ceylon. But do you think the source is implying it was malicious? I mean, did Cunningham and others want to deliberately bury Sri Lankan history?
I don't know if malicious is the right word. Maybe opportunistic, or simply systemically biased. You have to remember the context. Part of the British legitimization of their rule in India depended on presenting themselves as the enlightened successors to a great ancient civilization. If they could locate the Holy Land of Buddhism within their crown jewel within India, it added immense prestige. It added historical weight to their empire.
It's a great talking point. We, the British Empire, are the modern custodians of the land of the Buddha.
Exactly. Whereas Ceylon, in their eyes, was a plantation colony. A useful, profitable island, to be sure, but it wasn't the mainland. There was a powerful psychological and political bias to center all of ancient history on that big red blotch on the world map that was British India.
So that bias, the source argues, effectively blinded them to the forensic reality on the ground. They ignored the definitions of Deepa, they ignored the Rodawal distinctions in their own treaties, and they ignored the glaring fact that the ruins in India simply didn't match the grandeur of Faxian's descriptions.
They saw what their worldview needed them to see. And because they were the ones writing the first modern textbooks and drawing the first modern archaeological maps, we've all been seeing it that way ever since.
And that is really why this deep dive matters so much. It's not just about correcting a GPS coordinate on an ancient map. It's about, as the source says, archaeological integrity. Because if this theory is correct, or even plausible, then the incredible sites in Anuradhapura in Sarawila in the north of Sri Lanka, they aren't just regional variations of Buddhism that spread from India.
They are the source. They are the core. They are the Jambudvipa that Faxian was seeking. It completely changes the historical value of every brick and every stone in Sri Lanka. It suggests that the early history of Buddhism is a maritime history, a history of island federations, not just a story of a continental spread from a single point in the Ganges Plain.
It really is a forensic reevaluation. It demands that we look at the evidence, the physical evidence, the height of the stupas, the measured distance of the footprints, the precise wording of the treaties, and that we do it without the filter of those 19th century colonial assumptions.
And that's often the hardest thing to do in history, isn't it? To unlearn what you think is a foundational fact. We're so used to the map being the map. But as this file shows, sometimes the map is just a drawing made by someone who never actually saw the place they were drawing.
So, a final thought for everyone listening. If the Middle Kingdom was an island nation all along, and the whole idea of a continent was a mistranslation of Deepa, of land, how many other ancient maps have we been reading completely upside down, all because of assumptions made over a century ago?
It makes you question everything.
It really does. So the next time you hear about the Middle Kingdom or you see a map of the Buddha's travels, maybe zoom in on that teardrop island just off the coast of India, look at the mountains, look at the stupas that rival the pyramids, and just ask yourself, is this the edge of the story? Or could it be the center?
Fascinating question to ponder.
Thanks for going down this very deep rabbit hole with us. We'll see you on the next deep dive.